Silas McDowell swung the heavy axe, the steel biting deep into the dry lodgepole pine. It was the summer of 1843, high in the Colorado Rockies, and the air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine resin and the buzzing of flies. He was a man in his late 30s, sinewy and tough, with a beard bleached by the relentless high-altitude sun. He had come to this valley to build a life, to trap, and to ranch a few head of cattle, but he was discovering that the land he had chosen was profoundly unforgiving in ways he had not anticipated. He stopped his work, leaning on the axe handle, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a rough linen sleeve. The sound of the flies was maddening, a high, thin whine that seemed to be laughing at him. They were gathered on the south wall of his cabin, and more importantly, around the shallow pit he had dug beneath his floorboards. He knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, what that sound meant. He walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy on the packed earth. The structure was solid, built of the pine he was now cutting for winter firewood. It was a good cabin, tight-seamed, with a fieldstone chimney that drew perfectly, but it was not a fortress against the one enemy he hadn't prepared for: the heat. In the east, in Ohio where he'd grown up, summer was a green, damp, hazy affair. Here, the sun was a physical weight, an anvil pressing down from a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The ground itself baked. He crouched by the loose-fitting trapdoor in his floor, the one he'd built with such pride, believing it was the proper way to make a root cellar. He pulled the rawhide loop. The air that rose from the darkness below was not the cool, moist breath of a cellar. It was a wave of sickness, a warm, damp, putrid smell that made his stomach clench. He lit a tallow candle and descended the 3 short steps. There, on the shelf, was the haunch of the buck he had killed only 3 days prior. It had been a clean kill, a hard drag back to the cabin. He had butchered it with care, wiping it clean, intending to eat it fresh, to save his precious salt and smoke for the main herd he hoped to cull in the fall. Now the meat was ruined. A greenish sheen covered it, and the smell was overwhelming. Beside it, a small wooden bucket of milk, drawn that very morning, had already begun to separate, a sour tang rising from it. He felt a cold fury not at the land, but at his own ignorance. This pit, this supposed cellar, was worse than useless. It was a trap, a catchment for mildew and decay. The earth, baked by the sun, was releasing its heat back into the pit all night long, turning it into a slow oven. He had lost the deer, and with it, days of hard hunting and the promise of fresh meat. He carried the spoiled haunch out, his face a mask of disgust, and threw it far into the gully for the coyotes. He stood for a long time, watching the sun begin to dip behind the western peaks, the air already growing chill. This land was a place of violent contrasts. The nights were cold, even in August, but the days were hot enough to spoil meat in hours. He had no ice. Salt was a luxury, carried hundreds of miles by wagon, and costing more than gunpowder. Smoking was a long, laborious process that drew flies and predators, and left the meat tasting of ash. He needed a way to keep things fresh. He looked over at the small, clear spring that bubbled from the hillside 50 yards away, the water that was the reason he'd built his cabin here. It was icy cold, constant, and pure. He stared at it, his mind turning. The land held the problem, he thought. It must also hold the answer. But it was an answer he did not yet know, and with the long, desperate winter only months away, he knew that ignorance was a luxury he could not afford. The failure of his cellar was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat to his survival. His first attempt to solve the problem had been a miserable failure, a testament to building from memory instead of observation. Silas McDowell had built his cabin just as his father had in the Ohio Valley, a sturdy box of hewn logs set on a patch of flat, dry ground. The root cellar, by that tradition, was a simple pit dug beneath the main floor. It was a logical design in a land of gentle summers and deep, insulated winters, where the earth below the frost line held a stable, cool temperature. But here, in the high Rockies, the rules were different. The intense, high-altitude sun striking the dry soil from May to September heated the ground to a surprising depth. His cabin floor, built of split logs, was a shade, but it wasn't insulation. The heat penetrated the earth around the cabin and radiated inward, turning his subterranean pit into a trap. The air within it was stagnant, humid from the soil, and, as he had learned, lethally warm. He had spent the first year in a state of constant low-grade desperation, racing against the clock of decay. He smoked venison until it was dry as boot leather, the constant pall of hickory and alder smoke clinging to his clothes and drawing the unwanted attention of a grizzly bear that patrolled the valley. He tried packing meat and salt, but his small barrel ran low by the first winter, and the journey to the trading post at Bent's Fort was a perilous, month-long affair. He lost food constantly. He'd kill a deer and have to gorge on it for 2 days, then throw the rest to the wolves, a waste that felt like a sin. He lost milk, cheese, and the precious wild berries he gathered. He tried burying a wooden box in the shaded earth of the aspen grove, but the ground squirrels and marmots found it within a week, burrowing in and fouling his stores. He was living hand-to-mouth in a land of plenty, all for the lack of a simple patch of cold. His frustration mounted with the heat of that second summer. He felt tricked. He had followed the wisdom he'd been given, the standard methods, and they were failing him at every turn. He sat on his stoop one evening, sharpening his skinning knife, the stone hissing against the steel. He looked at his hands, calloused and cracked. He was working hard, but he wasn't working smart. He was trying to force the Ohio Valley onto the spine of the continent, and the continent was refusing. He began to feel a creeping doubt. It wasn't just his cellar that was wrong. It was his entire approach. He was fighting the land, trying to impose his will on it, when the land was clearly more powerful than he was. That night, he couldn't sleep. The cabin was hot, stuffy with the smell of old smoke and cooked meat. He got up and walked out into the moonlight. The valley was silent, bathed in a cold, silver light. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees since sunset. He walked to the spring, the grass wet and cold against his bare feet. He knelt and plunged his hands into the pool where the water gathered before spilling into the creek. The cold was a shock, a sudden piercing ache that shot up to his elbows. It was so cold it felt like a burn. He held his hands under the surface, feeling the water flow over them, and a realization began to dawn, slow and heavy. The water was not just cold, it was constantly cold. It was 40 degrees in the 90-degree heat of midday, and it was 40 degrees in the 40-degree chill of midnight. It was an anchor. It was the one stable thing in this entire valley of extremes. He had been digging in the hot earth, the sun-baked, passive, dead ground, when this river of cold was flowing right past his door, wasted. He had been trying to build a box to trap the cold, when what he needed was a box to trap the spring. The next day, Silas did not pick up his axe to cut firewood. He picked up his shovel and a pry bar. He walked past his useless root cellar, past the cabin, and stood over the eye of the spring. He spent the entire morning just watching. He studied how the water emerged from the hillside, not in a rush, but in a steady, determined flow from beneath a large granite boulder. He studied the slope of the land, the way the water naturally wanted to run. He studied the sun, tracking its arc across the sky, noting that this particular patch of hillside, facing north, was in shadow for all but the earliest morning hours. This, he realized, was the place. But he would not learn from his old traditions alone. He had seen, on a long trapping expedition the previous winter, an abandoned Ute encampment. He had found one in their food caches, a small pit dug not in the open, but in the permanent shadow of a cliff, lined with willow branches and slabs of shale, and covered with aspen bark. It was simple, and it was intelligent. It used shade, stone, and airflow. He also remembered something an old trapper, a man named Jedediah, had told him at a rendezvous. Jedediah had scoffed at the settlers' cabins. "You build 'em to sweat in, boy," the old man had cackled, his teeth stained with tobacco. "You put 'em right in the sun. An animal builds its den in the shade, in the earth. You build yours like a cook-pot." The pieces began to fit together. He needed the spring's constant cold. He needed the Utes' understanding of shade and stone. And he needed to think, as Jedediah had implied, like an animal, to use the earth itself not as a floor, but as a roof. His idea was radical and, to his way of thinking, dangerously new. He would not dig a pit. He would build a small stone house directly over the spring, sinking its foundations deep into the hillside until it was half buried. He would build a room for the spring. He spent 2 days planning, scratching designs onto a piece of slate with a nail. The structure would have to be low and thick. He would dig into the hillside, using the earth as insulation on 3 sides. The walls would be thick, dry-stacked stone, using the endless supply of granite fieldstone from the valley floor. The roof would not be shingles, which would bake in the sun, but heavy timbers covered with a thick layer of sod, just like the roof of a beaver's lodge. The inside was the critical part. He couldn't just let the spring flood the floor. He designed a stone channel, a miniature canal, that would guide the water directly through the center of the room, entering at the back wall and exiting under the front. The food would not sit in the water, which would ruin it. It would sit on wide, flat stone shelves he would build on either side of the channel. The air, cooled by the icy water, would circulate around the food. He realized he also needed ventilation. If he sealed it tight, the moisture would create mold. He needed the air to move. He designed a small, low inlet vent near the door and a high exhaust vent, a small pipe at the back, disguised as a rock. The warmer, lighter air would rise and exit, pulling the cold, heavy air from the water's surface across the shelves. It was, he thought, a machine for cold. He began the work at the end of August, when the risk of flash floods was lowest. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. The first task was to divert the spring itself. He built a temporary cofferdam of logs, clay, and sod, forcing the water into a shallow ditch that bypassed his chosen build site. The ground, now merely damp instead of flowing, was still heavy and cold. He dug straight into the north-facing slope, his shovel grating on hidden stones, his pry bar straining against roots. He was not just clearing a space, he was carving a socket out of the mountain. He dug until the back wall was a sheer face of damp earth and rock, over 6 feet high. The floor of his excavation was precisely at the level of the spring's eye. Then he began hauling stone. For 3 weeks, he did nothing but find, haul, and place rocks. He used his mule to drag the largest boulders from the creek bed, rolling them into place with the pry bar to form the foundation. Then came the walls, a puzzle of 1,000 pieces. He chose flat-faced stones, stacking them meticulously, fitting them, finding smaller stones to chink the gaps. His hands were raw, his knuckles split and bleeding, the cold mud packing into the wounds. He built the walls 3 feet thick, knowing the mass of the stone was as important as the stone itself. Halfway through, Jedediah rode through the valley. The old trapper stopped his horse, stared at the deep stone pit Silas was building, and spat. "What in God's name is that, McDowell? A root cellar? Looks more like a tomb." Silas paused, wiping his face. "A spring house." "A what?" "I'm building a house for the spring. It'll keep the food." Jedediah squinted, then shook his head. "You're moonstruck. That thing'll flood. Then it'll freeze solid. Then it'll fill with snakes. You build a smokehouse, like a sensible man." Silas just nodded. "Maybe so, Jed, but I'm tired of eating smoke." He turned back to his work, lifting another stone. Jedediah watched for a moment longer, then rode on, convinced the newcomer had lost his mind. The most delicate part was the channel. Silas used the flattest, smoothest stones he could find, mortaring them with a thick slurry of clay and sand to make the channel walls watertight. It ran straight down the middle of the floor, a dark, perfectly straight trough. He built the stone shelves on either side, heavy slabs of schist that he levered into place, raised a foot above the floor. Finally, the roof. He felled 4 thick lodgepole pines, stripped them, and dragged them across the stone walls. On top of these beams he laid a tight layer of aspen poles, and on that, a layer of thick pine bark, stripped from dead trees. The final step was the insulation. He cut bricks of turf from the meadow, thick with roots, and laid them carefully over the entire roof, packing them tight, grass side up. When he was finished, the structure had vanished. It looked like nothing more than a low, grassy mound on the hillside, with a single heavy plank door set into its face. He built that door from 2 layers of thick pine, stuffing the gap between them with dried moss. He hung it on heavy iron hinges and fitted it with a strong latch. He removed the coffer dam. The spring, returned to its original path, found the new channel he had built. It slid into the darkness of the stone house with a quiet gurgle, flowed through the central channel, and emerged from the culvert under the door, perfectly clear and cold. He opened the door and peered inside. The air that hit his face was a revelation. It was 40 degrees, profoundly still, and smelled of wet stone and clean water. It was the smell of the deep earth. The true test came a week later. The relentless heat of late summer returned, a dry, baking oppression that wilted the high meadow flowers and sent the animals into the deep shade. The air in Silas's cabin was hot and thick, the split-log walls warm to the touch. He had gone hunting and brought back a yearling buck. He'd also traded for a small wheel of cheese and a gallon of milk from a family that had settled in the lower valley, their few cows struggling on the dry grass. This was his gamble. He butchered the deer, keeping a quarter of the venison fresh. He placed the meat on a clean wooden platter, put the milk in a clay jug, the cheese in a linen cloth, and a knob of precious butter in a small crock. He carried them to the spring house. Opening the heavy, moss-insulated door was like opening a door to another season. The cold air rushed out, swirling around his ankles. He stepped down onto the stone floor. Inside, it was dark and silent, save for the musical murmur of the spring flowing through its central channel. The air was humid, but it was a cold humidity, like a mountain cave. He placed the milk, butter, and cheese on the low stone shelf, just inches from the flowing water. He hung the venison from a hook he'd set in one of the roof beams, where the cold air would circulate. He stood there for a moment, feeling the profound, stable chill of the place. It felt like a sanctuary. He closed the heavy door, the latch clicking shut with a solid thud. And then, he waited. He forced himself to stay away for 3 days. 3 days in this heat would have turned the milk to sour curds, and the meat to green rot in his old cellar. On the 3rd morning, he walked to the spring house. He opened the door. The same puff of cold cave air greeted him. He lit a candle. The milk in the jug was perfectly sweet. The butter in the crock was so hard he could barely mark it with his thumbnail. The cheese was cool and firm. He looked at the venison. It was dark red, firm, and perfectly, beautifully fresh. A profound sense of relief, so deep it was almost painful, washed over him. It had worked. He left the rest of the meat. He waited 5 days, a week, 10 days. The venison aged, becoming more tender, but it did not spoil. The milk lasted 6 days before it began to turn, an impossible feat. The butter remained as fresh as the day it was churned. He had done it. He had built a passive refrigerator from stone, earth, and water. That winter Jedediah returned, his supplies low, his face gaunt. He had lost most of his smoked meat to a wolverine. Silas wordlessly led him to the spring house. He opened the door to reveal fresh-looking venison, firm potatoes, and barrels of apples he'd traded for, all sitting in the 40-degree air, protected from the 20 below zero blizzard raging outside. The spring house, he had discovered, was a two-way regulator. In summer, it kept the heat out. In winter, the 40-degree water and the massive insulation of the earth kept the lethal cold out, preventing his stores from freezing solid. Jedediah stared, speechless. He finally looked at Silas, his eyes wide with a respect that bordered on awe. "McDowell," he whispered, "you didn't build a tomb. You built a miracle." The spring house's success was too obvious to remain a secret. Jedediah, humbled and pragmatic, was the first to ask for help. "I ain't no stonemason, McDowell," he admitted, "but I'm a man who's tired of chewing on leather." Silas helped him cite his own, a cruder version built of log and earth, but based on the same principle. Dug into a north-facing hill, with a vent and a thick insulated door. It didn't have a spring running through it, but it was dug deep enough to catch the ambient chill of the earth, and it was a vast improvement. But it was the settlers who arrived in the following years who truly adopted his design. A family named Harris, arriving with 3 young children in 1845, built their cabin a mile down the valley. Silas watched them digging a shallow pit under their floor and felt a grim sense of foreboding. He walked over, introduced himself, and over the course of an evening explained his method. He didn't command. He just told his own story of the spoiled venison and the revelation at the spring. The father, a practical man named Elias Harris, listened intently. The next day, Elias and his eldest son were at Silas's spring house, taking notes, measuring the stones, feeling the cold air. They built their own, almost a perfect copy, diverting a small creek to run along its back wall. That first summer, their children had cold, fresh milk. Their meat did not spoil. Their vegetables stayed crisp. The spring house became the difference between subsistence and security. The idea spread, carried by word of mouth from one valley to the next. It became a hallmark of a well-built homestead. "Has it got a spring house?" became the first question a new arrival would ask about a piece of land. The design evolved. Some built with sandstone, others with timber. In valleys without springs, men dug deep cellars, 8 or 10 feet into the ground, often with a small stone-lined entryway and a secondary insulated door, creating an airlock. They learned to build ventilation shafts, cold chimneys, that would pull the warm air out and draw the heavy cold air in. The core principle that Silas had uncovered, using the Earth's stable temperature and insulation, rather than fighting the air's variable one, became embedded in the local knowledge. Decades later, long after Silas had built his last structure, the railroad brought commercial ice, cut from frozen lakes and packed in sawdust. People built ice boxes, but in the high valleys, the old spring houses were still preferred. They cost nothing to run. They did not fail when a shipment was late. They did not melt. They were a piece of the mountain itself, harnessed. Silas McDowell's innovation had become tradition, a silent, grassy mound on a hillside that represented the most crucial lesson of the frontier, that survival was not a matter of imposing your will, but of listening with humility and adapting with intelligence. His design had saved countless families from sickness, hunger, and the quiet desperation of waste. What Silas McDowell had understood, without having the words for it, were the fundamental principles of geothermal stability and thermal mass. The machine he had built was a masterpiece of passive design. Its engine was the spring, and the spring's power came from the deep earth. Far below the surface, the ground temperature is not affected by the daily or even seasonal whims of the weather. It holds at the mean annual air temperature of the region. In Silas's valley, that temperature was around 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The spring was a thermometer, bringing that deep, constant cold to the surface. His first mistake, the cellar under the cabin, had been to dig in the active zone, the top few feet of earth that baked in the summer and froze in the winter. His genius was to identify the spring as a passive zone made active, a river of stability. The spring house worked because of three primary factors. First, the constant cold of the water acted as a massive cooling engine, a heat sink. Any warm air that entered the spring house was immediately cooled, as its heat was transferred to the water and washed away. Second, the structure itself was a battery. The thick stone walls and, most importantly, the massive insulating layer of the earth and sod roof provided immense thermal mass. This mass resisted any change in temperature. It was a barrier that the summer sun simply could not penetrate. It would take weeks of constant heat to raise the temperature of those stones even 1 degree. Third, his ventilation system was critical. By placing a low inlet and a high outlet, he created a natural convection current. The humid air, having absorbed warmth from any food, would rise and exit the high vent, pulling in fresh, cold air from the surface of the water. He had built a system that breathed. In the winter, the same principles worked in reverse. When the air outside plunged to 20 below zero, the 40-degree spring continued to flow. The water warmed. The air in the sealed house and the massive insulation of the earth and snow on the roof prevented that warmth from escaping. His spring house was not just a refrigerator. It was a regulator, keeping his food in the perfect stable temperature range of 40-45 degrees, year-round, without a single stick of firewood, block of ice, or grain of salt. It was a solution that was perfectly, elegantly, and profoundly adapted to its specific place. A lesson in working with the laws of physics instead of against them. Silas McDowell lived in that valley for another 30 years. He saw the railroad come, saw the small settlements turn into towns, and saw the arrival of manufactured goods that made his old, hard-won self-sufficiency seem quaint. But he never stopped using the spring house. Even when he could buy ice from the town, he preferred the clean, damp chill of the stone house and the sweet taste of the water. He was known as a quiet man, one who had figured something out, and other settlers often came to him not for supplies, but for advice. He would just point to the hills. "The mountain tells you how to build," he'd say. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen." When he passed, he was buried on the hillside overlooking his homestead. The cabin eventually fell, its logs rotting back into the earth. But the spring house remained. For a century it was used by new families, by hunters, by campers, a small grassy mound with a heavy door, its interior still holding the constant 40-degree chill. The spring house was his true legacy. It was more than a clever trick for keeping food. It was a physical argument for a different way of thinking. It was a monument to the idea that the environment is not an adversary to be conquered, but a system full of unwars. The land already provides the cooling, the heating, the stability. True innovation is not the act of forcing a new will upon a place, but the patient, humble act of discovering the logic that is already there. Silas McDowell's lesson was stone simple and mountain deep. Do not fight the world. Observe it. Find its engines, find its anchors, and harness them with respect. The solution is almost never a new invention. It is a new understanding. It is the quiet intelligence to see the spring for what it is. Not just water, but a constant reliable gift of cold, flowing from the heart of the earth.